This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network, where listeners and podcasters come together. Find out more at blueberrywithnoease.com.
The Eat Sleep Right podcast is brought to you by generous grant from the Built on Dreams Media Network, with additional funding by the Sims Media Foundation, and from the generosity of listeners like you.
Stand by, please. Rolling on 6. On 6.
Welcome to episode 119 of the Eat Sleep Right podcast. I'm your host, Adam Scull. The Eat Sleep Right podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at audibletrial.com/Eat Sleep Right. Over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, iPad, Kindle, or MP3 player. The podcast is available on eatsleepright.net as well as the iTunes store, where you can also subscribe to it. My goal is to find out how writers become authors, how they got where they are, how they do what they do, and how they go from a blank sheet of paper to a finished manuscript. eatsleepright.net is also made possible by the generous cooperation of Writers World Facebook group. Join the Writers World Facebook group. Learn how to become a better writer. If you enjoy the Eat Sleep Right podcast and you've had your own adventures in writing, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me about yourself and your story, and I may get back to you and have you as a guest on the Eat Sleep Right podcast. If you have any questions or comments, anything at all, I'd like to hear from you. The email address is comments@eatsleepright.net. Bruce Maul, welcome to the Eat Sleep Right podcast. It's great having you with me today.
Hey, Adam. Thank you so much for having me.
Your first book, YA Fantasy Fiction, Portals, Passages, and Pathways. What is it that draws you to YA Fantasy Fiction?
A great question. Well, let's start with the first part of it. Why YA? I like young adult because as a writer, it challenges me to be more descriptive without using such easy vocabulary that can be vulgar, intrusive. It is catered to a younger audience. It's so much more difficult to really leave it up to the reader's imagination when it comes to describing a scene. That's one reason for YA. Fantasy, just because, as a little boy I fell in love with The Hobbit and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, two of my favorite stories today. C.S. Lewis, what I love so much about him, his way of capturing something so important in our lives, who we are, where we come from in the fantasy mode. I just love it.
Being in your 40s and you're writing YA fiction, is it difficult for you to go back to being 14, 15, 16 years old?
Oh, no. I remember it just like it was yesterday. I may be in my 40s, but I don't feel like it. In fact, I think the teenage years for everybody is so detrimental to who we are in building our character, our outlook. Yes, we become hopefully wiser the older we get, more intelligent, but that's not always the case. Looking at our teenage years, though, think of all the firsts that we have. A first kiss, first time getting into a vehicle and driving it. All the little successes as a person, first little story, first game won, like tennis or hockey or football, it doesn't matter. There's so many firsts that is wonderful. I don't see how it's possible to ever lose that. So it's easy to relate.
Teenage years being detrimental?
Yes, detrimental to who we are.
What a fascinating thought. What brought you to that realization? And how does that affect your writing in the YA genre?
The reason it's detrimental, I believe, preteen and teenage, we're more open, our sensories, you could say, more open to the world around us. We're learning, we're consuming, we're watching, we're listening. We want so much to be a part of something. So it's that journey of finding who we are. The older I get more stuck in my ways, which I don't think is a bad thing. But as I develop as a husband, as a father, just as a person, I know what I like. I know what I don't like. I stand behind that. But I look back when, as a younger man, discovering the world, there's so many new things, not even knowing, am I a Republican? Am I a Democrat? There's so many, and I'm just using politics as a very bad example, but there's so many different things. I mean, even foods, you can look at that. So there's so many things that we just don't know.
There's a reason they call them the formative years.
You're right. Yes, you're right. I love that. I just love that. Now, would I want to go back to those years, Adam? No way. I think I loved it. It was a great experience. But to me, life is much easier with experience behind me. All that experience was wonderful. So that's why I love YA, because I get to revisit that as an author with my characters. It's, again, it may have been some time ago, but it doesn't feel like that.
What's the first story you ever read that influenced you so much you decided, this is what I want to do, I want to be a writer?
That's easy. The Hobbit. I'm guessing around 5th grade, my elementary years. The small little school library, looking for a book. There it was. I pulled this small book off the shelf that was tattered and pages, some of them coming out. And I opened it to the table of contents. One of the first things that caught my mind, I'm almost positive it's chapter 5, the chapter entitled Riddles in the Dark. I was fascinated. I'm like, riddles in the dark? I had to know. I just had to know why the author entitled it this. I read it and loved it. I mean, even the opening scene, just, Bilbo Baggins sitting there, smoking his pipe, and this strange man, just later we find out is a wizard, happens by, and all of it. The adventure, the journey, the unknown. And that was it. I knew I just loved stories. I've always known that I wanted to write.
Do you remember the first story you ever wrote?
Yes and no. That's a cop-out answer. I understand that. But hear me out. I was in junior high. I entitled it The Crystal. I remember it because I remember a couple of scenes in the book, but I never finished it. That was probably my first big project. I actually had a couple of chapters.
But I'm still curious if you can travel back and be 14 again.
No, I can't become 14 in an instant. For me to have my creative writing, I kind of have my writing in different steps, I guess you could say. And when I'm not working on creative, like if I'm just editing or whatever, that's a different type of setting. But for me to get into creative mode, I need to set the scene around me physically. The lighting, the sounds, the noises. Once I do that, then I start to revisit my past. That's when it comes to life. When I revisit my own past, my own 14-year-old experiences. Once there, it just takes off.
Do you have a female YA character?
There are several. Portals, Passages, and Pathways does follow 2 characters, a dual point of view book. Those are males. We see this world and the story through their eyes. However, there are key female characters that relate both to Jack and to Simon. So yes.
Here's why I asked. Can a 40-year-old male successfully write a female YA character?
I say yes without wanting to sound pompous because of the feedback I have received. And I think it's because when I was younger, I related more to the girls. And part of that may have been, hey, I'll openly admit, as a boy, I was a mama's boy. My mom spent a lot of time with me. I just felt more comfortable around females. So even as a little child, when I was in elementary school, playing tag and all that, I had a lot of girl friends. I think it was easier for me. With that said, getting older, my teenage years, I remember falling in love when I was 14 years old, in fact. And I just absorbed the relationship, just wanting to be with her. So there are, of course, bits and pieces of past relationships.
Tell me more about your book.
Portals, Passages, and Pathways which I guess I should say is a series. In the Land of Magnanthia is book 1. The entire series is about our pathways in life and the consequences of the choices we make while on these paths. Because we all have choices. Major things happen to us in life we can't control. Those are the portals. We can't control that. Then there's the pathways. All the choices we make each and every day that we make. So ultimately it's deciding how are we going to be. Because yes, when we're teenagers, when we're young, the world is impacting us. But we have choices to make. Each and every one of us have choices to make. And we can go down different paths. And whatever path we choose is going to ultimately bring us to our demise. When Jack and Simon are two different boys that make, of course, different decisions, and we see, as these two boys enter the world of Magnanthia from our world, the choices they make along the way that really make a difference of who they are and their outcome in life.
Which leads me to the point of how does a 14, 15, or 16-year-old realize they are making decisions that will affect their future road? At that age, they live moment to moment.
That's very interesting. I like that question. Specifically, Jack and Simon are no different than other teenagers in that respect. Because, like us, even now, I guess our older years, Adam, we make decisions and often learn from those decisions as we look back. And I agree. Our teenage years, you're just going through day to day, and sometimes the younger we are, we don't realize that there's a moment where we're making a major decision that's going to change who we are. The interesting thing is, we often have those around us who have been there and done it, aka mom and dad, other people in our lives who are older and have been down that path.
Who, of course, we never listen to.
Exactly. So what do? We end up looking back going, if only I just would have listened. Jack and Simon, they experience that. They experience also I'm going to try to do this way or my way, or I have a better way because I'm a teenager, so I know better. In this case, fantasy world, this wizard who's been around for a long time. So here's what I'm going to do. And they run into that too.
Do the characters realize they make decisions that will affect their path?
I don't think they realize it. In fact, often I find later through discussion that readers often don't even realize it. And that's what makes it relatable in our lives, even as adults. We never leave that. Take a few examples, and this will help understand. Some of the time, we realize that it's a major decision. Portals represent things that happen to us that we don't have control over, so it's not necessarily a decision we're making. A death of a loved one, that's not something we decide. A terminal illness, whatever it may be, good or bad, things happen to us we cannot control. Those are portals. Passages may be more events that are bigger, a career choice, a job that we apply to, friends that we choose. Sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're not. We're often not aware of, when we make friends with a particular person, the effects that may have. Pathways, we tend to just go through life making these decisions without ultimately thinking about it. What pants I put on. Small and perhaps even stupid example, but we make many decisions that throughout the day lead us in that path in that day. So there are many things. Most of the time, we are not aware of the consequences or even the fact that there is another decision. We often feel trapped, like this is my only choice. And then there are those moments when right in front of us, we have a choice to make. So sometimes Jack and Simon, they may have that choice right in front of them. And they know, okay, I either have A or B, and here's what I'm going to choose. But most of the time, these decisions we're just not aware of because most of the time we don't take the time to think of the consequences of our actions. We tend to view teenagers maybe as just living the seat of their pants. There's much more involved. That's another thing that I love about our teenage years. Yes, we tend to act like we're doing something the seat of our pants, but no, there's much more beneath that level.
Are you an outliner, or do you write by the seat of your pants?
I outlined the first 22 chapters. I used a half of a chapter. So I would say a combination really thereof. I do need, and I have a ton of notes. When I think of something that's very vital, when a character speaks to me outside of my writing moments, I jot it down and incorporate that. But outlining doesn't work for me. I tend just to go with the seat of my pants.
It's clear you're really good at remembering your teenage years, but how do you write what you know without writing about yourself?
Wow, that's a good one.
In other words, is there a lot of you in the book?
There's some. I can never admit that as an author there's no part of me. I think that's impossible as a creative writer. That's my opinion. It's not that difficult because a lot of times it's of other relationships and other people I know. In my experiences, perhaps these are people I met in my experience, but they're not me. So it's fun to jump into their shoes and go along with the ride. And that's what happens with these other characters. So they're not me.
Editing.
Oh.
Love it or hate it?
Hate it. I do quite a bit. That's my anal part of me. I have to do as much as possible. Hate editing, but for the characters, what they're doing, that everything connects, that's very important to me. I want every detail of the story to connect. So there's a reason for it. If I don't explain it, I either change it or make sure I explain it further down the road. I do have a really good editor, bless her heart. So I don't worry too much about it. Even with storyline, she helps with that if there's things I forgot. But I hate it because it slows me down.
Are you good at showing and not telling?
I think that's one of my strengths. The reader is able to put themselves there because I'm showing them what's going on. At the same time, it'd be easy to argue that with me because of the amount of adjectives I use. But to be honest, I think J.K. Rowling, she used a lot of adjectives, and I have to admit that as a reader, I absorbed that even though adjectives are telling. But she also did a very good job at times at actually showing.
Are you self-published or traditionally published?
Self-published. I planned it that way. I don't know if I'm going to go traditional. I have submitted to a few agents that I'm interested in, but I don't know if I'm willing to give up the creative licensure, if that's what it is. I'm not sure what that's called, but I don't want to give that up. I like to have control over it, but at the same time, if it helps to get to the masses, I would consider traditional.
Being self-published, one of the freedoms you can't give up is marketing. How are you at it?
Marketing. That's up there with editing. I don't like it. I really don't. If I could find someone who that's what their love is, and they have a passion for that, I would consider a partnership because I hate it. I just want to write.
What have you learned as a writer?
About myself, the most interesting thing I've learned is given the chance to do what I was wired to do far exceeds any monetary amount I have lost in the past or maybe even the future by working a career/job. I love it. It is what I was meant to do, and it comes as easy as breathing.
Takeaway advice to other writers?
Oh, just write what you love. Do not go with what is hot at the time. Even though it's something that most people would think, well, that's obvious. I've already had numerous people in the field who's been in the field much longer say, well, if you would write this type or that type, we would consider doing something with you. No, I won't compromise what I love.
Where can we find out more about you and your book on the internet?
Amazon.com. I've utilized for self-publishing of the softcover. It's available there to order, and also, of course, the ebook. You can find out more about me and Portals, Passages, and Pathways at brmaul.wordpress.com.
Bruce Maul, YA fantasy fiction author of Portals, Passages, and Pathways, thank you so much for being with me today on the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast.
Thank you so much, Adam. It has been a treat visiting with you.
If you're looking for a community that can offer you tools, support, and advice to start your own adventures in writing, then prepare to have the cauldron of your imagination stirred. I started the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast so more people can understand what it's like to be a writer and to get more eyes on your books. My goal is to help you achieve the success you so richly deserve. I salute your success in writing.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Eat Sleep Right podcast, located at eatsleepright.net. Please send any questions, comments or suggestions to comments@eatsleepright.net. Please consider a donation to support the Eat Sleep Right podcast. Donations can be sent to our PayPal address at donations@eatsleepright.net. Once in a lifetime, the theme music for the Eat Sleep Right podcast, courtesy of Stephen Paul, all rights reserved, used by permission. Please join us again for the next edition of the Eat Sleep Right podcast.